I'm in my basic sites directory. You can put this wherever you want as long as you have Rails installed and Ruby installed. I don't think I'm using 2.6 at this point for Ruby, but I will be updating that soon. It's not something you need to do to make this app work by any means, but to kick things off, we need to make the actual app, and the trick here is passing a flag that is newer in version 5.0, I believe, of Rails. That is Rails, not in all caps. So we'll do Rails new. Let's say record store. I would have called this backend, but I've already have a site called that, so I'm gonna just call back. And then make sure to pass 2 dashes in API when you create the app. So one caveat to all of this is if you followed along, say the past 3 or so of my builds, I use a template. And in this case, we're not going to be using any views based in our Rails app. So there's really no need to pass in the template in my mind, because I'm actually not using devise either in this series. So we're going to be using the default user stuff that comes with Rails, but we still need to set up some logic to make it all work so we can have access to a current user. It's a little more work to get running. Devise is so awesome that we usually can kind of look right over that. But in our case, I want to make sure we can use Vue to its full extent and process the username and password and emails the way we want. We don't need to have all the stuff that Devise gives us for this simple app. So your results might vary there. I might do something in the future that is more Devise related with this kind of route. So the API plus Devise. But with Devise, as you know, there's views with that too. You can optionally generate them, but you don't have to. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. You can follow along and do the same. So with an API, I think I covered this in another video. Basically, it installs everything we need, but doesn't render anything to do with views. So we won't need anything in regards to actual HTML for this to work. So you might notice, let me cd into the app. So cd record store back. Okay. So I'll open this in Sublime. I do have the other project open in another desktop. So I'm going to put this one on the very far end as our new app. Remember, this one's called Record Store Back, and the other is called Record Store Backend. Sorry if those are kind of conflicting. I don't mean to be confusing, but it just helps me to make this a painless process as I record. So because the backend, I want to explain a few things. Like we don't have a controller yet, but it will. I'll show you on the other app. Eventually we'll have a namespace for these artists. For instance, it'll render actual JSON back, and that's going to be important because we actually want that data not in any format other than JSON to use on our Vue app. So as we generate this stuff, we'll make sure that happens. But you notice that happens for every action we have here. But a lot of the stuff is still the same, where you have to find the parameter by ID or require the fields that are permitted for the forms. It's all kind of the same stuff, but you're just handling the data a bit differently. So with our app generated, I'll go ahead and install a few gems we'll need. There's 3 I think I'm going to use, and then I'm going to actually uncomment one as well. So we need to use bcrypt and Redis. Redis is, they use it for action cable by default, but it's just a way to use background processing as stuff you do in the background for this stuff. Bcrypt is a way to use this method called hash secure password, which is great for if you don't use Devise. It allows the user to generate a password token, basically, that's just scrambled digest, I guess you could say, of a password. Kind of encrypted, basically, is the way that gem works. On top of that, I want to add a few more. We're going to uncomment rat cores because we need that for the API. And then I'm going to add, we already have Redis, so I'm going to add just JWT Sessions I mentioned in the first video. And at this time it is squiggly line arrow 2.3. Oops. Cool. So JWT Sessions is a gem that's basically a way to do token authentication. That's hard to say. So instead of the typical Rails setup that's kind of more based on session, this is more on web tokens. So the tokens like need to connect, and typically there's a certain format they come in, and it's all passed in the headers in the request. So it's kind of a confusing concept, but it's becoming more of the norm. The reason for an API, for instance, is to make use of an app anywhere. So if I wanted to deploy this record store app as a native mobile app, I could do that because the backend could communicate the same way everything else has been with the Vue app. So that's the beauty of an API route that I see. But other than that, we just need to run bundle at this point. So I'll go ahead and do that. Cool. So most of it's already installed that we really need. We could have bypassed a lot of this stuff like active storage, for instance, but I'm trying to keep this simple because it gets a little hairy later on how we implement a lot of this logic. So from there, we can go and start thinking about our API. Before I do that, I want to create a user model similarly to what we usually do when we set up devise. If you've used my template in the past, it does that automatically. So this is kind of a refresher on that. If you go back early in my series, I do devise from scratch if you really want to know how to work that. But again, we aren't using devise in this series, so I'm going to just do it the old school way, which isn't really old school. It's just the way you do it if you didn't want to use devise. So I'm going to create a model that is a user model, and G is short for generator, or generate, excuse me. I could just type it out so it's clear. I'll pass email as a string. Yep. So email is a string. Pro tip, if you want it to be a string by default, you don't pass anything. It will just assume it is. And then a password digest, which is typically what the bcrypt looks for the password it generates. So that is to a string, and we'll leave that go. So we want to pass this. I do want to modify migration it generates. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll run this generator, and it creates this migration, which is what we want. In here, the key thing I want to do is set a null value to false. So it can't be blank on the database level, which is important for our Vue app. Once we get to it, we can't have actually null attributes to save. So that's just kind of a fail-safe way at the database level to make sure the user data exists to log in, log out, sign up, etc. I'll save that and I'll run Rails DB migrate. All right. And in our user model, I need to update next the handle that bcrypt gives us. So what this is going to end up looking like is a has secure password, which comes from bcrypt, allows us to use that. And then what we need to do next is update our routes to have our new controllers. So what I want to do first is generate some controllers that are in an API namespace. So what that actually entail is a new folder within our controllers that's going to end up being API, and then within that a v1. And typically what you do with an API is namespace it in versions, because as versions update, you can't quite just change things on the fly because there's other third parties maybe using that version. So they need to opt in on their own as opposed to you forcing them to opt in. And that's kind of just a common practice when introducing an API to the public. So let's go ahead and generate a controller. Maybe I'll generate one. So I'm going to do a scaffold artist and then just have a name string. So all it's going to end up being is a string on the artist. We will need to add the user ID to that. So let me actually back up. Rails destroy artist. Cool. So that's a little tip there. If you want to ever undo what you did, you can do D or destroy there and it'll roll it back. So actually I want to do Rails generate scaffold artist. We'll pass name, will be a string, and then user references. And what that does is adds a user ID to the artist table, which we'll need to reference later. It also adds an index for that. So when I run this, you'll see in our migration, oops, this one here, we got a foreign key and it references table and a string. We can see in the schema coming up that that will have what we're after. So I'll run Rails db migrate. Okay. So here now we have a user ID on the artist table. That should be what we need for now. For the artist, the records are going to be a little different. So we'll do that next. I will do Rails generate scaffold record. It will have a title, it's a string. Year, a string. We'll reference both the user and the artist. So we'll do that like this. These are just shorthands. You could do this stuff on your own too by using separate migrations. This is honestly just saves a lot of time. So as you get familiar with Rails, this stuff will be more clear of what it means. I know it was fuzzy for me when I first started. So I would end up doing add user ID and its own migration, which is sometimes nice. You could roll that back on its own as opposed to the whole table. But in this case, this is, we're scaffolding stuff, so we're just learning. It's not necessarily super important. So I think this is all the data I need for the records. I have the title, I have the year, the artist. I think it should be singular here. Yeah, let's try that. Let's see if that works for us. Records, just artists. I feel like that might need to be, no, that's right, okay. So rake or Rails db migrate again. Cool. So then our schema now has this much going on. So we have our title, our year, our artist ID, which is important. I'll need to reference the artist to know what record to append, or to know how to create a record. I need to know what artist it's by. So to do that, we'll use the artist ID as a relation, and then the user ID. Then our created at, updated at comes by default. We have the artist ID as an index and the user ID as an index, which is great for performance and speed when indexing and looking up user data or records as the app scales. This app won't definitely scale at all, but it's kind of cool to know it could. So it's set up to do such a thing at this point. Okay, I think that's it for the main data we're going to be using. The harder parts are more to come when we get into our controllers. It did scaffold, as you saw, controllers right into the controllers directory. I want to actually namespace this. So what I want to do is modify where those controllers live. And what that means is I'll create an API folder and then a version 1. So it'll be v1 right there. I'm going to move these inside. So I'm I'll do it my way, just to move controllers or API v1 in there. And same with the records controller. So API v1. So the cool thing here is if your app ever updates, you change your API, maybe the functionality changes, maybe the data offering changes, I don't know, but you can create a new v2 instance and just go to town. That's the beauty of all this. So that's why we're namespacing it. Otherwise, things like trying to update those later would be very cumbersome, and you'd probably piss off a lot of people trying to use your API. So this is especially true for big apps and stuff like that in the wild. You need to make sure that stuff is versioned. So just moving those isn't enough to make them work yet. We need to actually update a few things about our controllers themselves and then routes. So since this is encased in a folder of API v1, we need to actually make modules that wrap around these nested levels. So what you do is do API module v1. This needs to be uppercase, by the way. The first letter of each class, it's considered kind of a Ruby class. It needs to be uppercase. So then we'll indent everything here to 4 spaces. And I will do 2 ends at the bottom. Cool. So that's set up to now scope itself to this folder level. We need to do the same for records. So I'll do that. All right, so that's like the newer stuff that we haven't touched on before because we haven't done much API work on this channel, but I will probably keep going down this path as I get more and more involved with Vue.js. I think it's pretty cool to hook into a database elsewhere and then do some work on top of that. So let's now work on making our model relations the way they should be. So I'll look into my models folder. Our artist is going to have many records, and it'll be dependent destroy. So if the artist deletes, I want to delete the records in my bank. You can choose to do that or not do that. I'm just doing it because it's simple and easy. So this can belong to a user. At this point, it should. I don't have that currently in my app because I think I got to a point to where I just didn't get it going. We're going to just include it on the record instead. But what I want to do on this level is validates the name field. And we just want to make sure there is something in that field once it's passed to the form. I can never spell presence right. Presence. I think that's right. True. So this is another layer of validation. So we have it on the database level on, say, the user information, but we can do it here too on the model. The artist is set up at this point. I want to do the record next. So this will belong to a user, can belong to a artist as well. I'm actually going to take that out for now. We're going to keep it just simple. Validates title, year, and then do presence true again. Cool. So our app should be set up. The user needs to have many records. Okay, hopefully the models didn't confuse you. I kind of abstracted some logic outside of the scope here. I just want the app to work in the end and get you to understand how the authentication process works. Because actually creating, editing, and deleting stuff from Vue isn't too complicated, but actually setting up a process in which you authenticate a user is, especially with JSON Web Tokens. It's kind of got its own workarounds to get things to work between Rails and Vue. It's is not just Vue stuff too. It's more on the scope of the front end framework of your choice. So say you use React or something, for example, that's just kind of the way that would work. Let's go and modify our routes real quick, and then I'll go ahead and stop for this video, and we'll start working on the actual authentication logic coming up for the sign in and sign up actions for our Vue app. So since we namespaced the controller level to API v1, we need to kind of do that in our routes too. So our URL looks like whatever our app name would be, like recordstore.com/v1 or API.v1/records. So your app, say it's a mobile app, say it's a web app, can access stuff at this level, assuming you have, privileges and are logged in and whatnot. There's also stuff that you need to think about when you release an API to the public in terms of letting things be accessible to the public. There's a lot of stuff in terms of setting up access privileges for third-party apps out there. So you'll see a lot of that. You have to pass in your own key and token and stuff to actually access it even. So this is beyond the scope of that. This is just getting your, I would say, your hands dirty in the sense of creating an API-based app. So what I want to do to make sure our paths match is go and namespace in our routes here. We could say namespace API do, so Ruby block. And inside that, we'll have our namespace of v1. That's lowercase in this particular instance. So within that, we'll have our resources for records and artists, and that allows us to have that URL I was just talking about. So API v1, for instance, and then you could restrict that to current whatever user. Maybe it's just a admin level user, whatever. You can do that here. You can do that on the controller level, even on the model level if you wanted. But we won't go that deep. So I want to do root. For now, I'll just do home. Index. We don't even have a home controller, so I'll just create it just for now. Doesn't really need to be there for now, but I'll do it anyway. So home controller. And we'll just do, what's the namespace? I forget. So that, we'll just make it home. We just need an index action. All right, cool. You will notice here on our application controller that action controller API is inheriting from that class is here. So typically on a typical Rails app, you won't see that. So that's something new too. Also notice in your application, certain things are just required here as opposed to including the whole Rails framework. So it's kind of a nice way to strip your app lean and use API only stuff, which you see here is configured to true. You can comment these out if you don't plan to use action cable, for instance, active storage, up to you how you want to do it. Besides that, I think we're at a point to where I can go ahead and pause for now, and we'll come back and start setting up the web token stuff, which is kind of the nitty gritty of this series. It's more complicated than pretty much anything I've done, but I think it's pretty cool to be able to extract from a big Rails web framework like this and absorb it through a front-end framework like Vue. So in the next video, we'll start tackling that. I'll see you then. Hello Rails is my new course on Ruby on Rails. I'll teach you Ruby on Rails from the ground up. Visit hellorails.io for more information.